Hello everyone, welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and I'm having a bit of a technical difficulty here. Just give me a second to figure out what is going on. Alright, so this week I'm going to be doing something a bit different than what I normally do, and instead of coming up with a themed show, I have decided to kind of talk a little bit more off the cuff. So instead of doing a lot of research on one topic, I have looked at just a couple of recent papers that have come out, and I'm hoping to discuss those with you in a bit more detail. So kind of taking just fewer number of things that don't really have anything to do with each other, and think about how scientists present the information that they research, and thinking a little bit about kind of science communication in general, not in terms of the stuff that we put together for the public, but what scientists actually put together for other scientists. And this is quite a different thing, and a lot of people out in the community actually don't get a chance to see much of this kind of behind-the-scenes sort of thing, because they only hear what's on the news or what's on the radio, what's in the newspaper, and so they don't actually get a chance to see, you know, how we put all these things together and what that primary literature actually looks like. And that actually is kind of interesting because there is a bit of a scientific underbelly, if you like, so it's kind of an intriguing thing to think about. And it was something that I was quite surprised about when I first started off, and I learned a lot, and you kind of figure out how to work within that context, and it's quite different from the sort of writing and the sort of communicating that you would do in other realms. And so you do have to really shift everything and learn a whole bunch of new skills. And so I want to talk about that a little bit today, but in order to kind of get everything set up just right, I want to take care of this one little technical glitch that we've got going. So first I'm going to play another song to start off with, and then I'll get back and really dive into things. Alright, that was Rufus Wainwright with Grey Gardens, and the first song I started off with today was One Paper Kid by Emmylou Harris and Willie Nelson. And thanks for hanging with me there. We've got everything fixed and now we're ready to go, ready to talk to you today about scientific publications, and then look at a couple of recent publications and find some of the latest news out there in my field of interest, which is looking at how humans and animals kind of, well actually not just humans and animals, but humans and all wildlife interact. So to start off with, I just want to talk a little bit about kind of what I consider to be a bit of the underbelly of science, and that is kind of the whole scene associated with publishing, because it can be a really stressful thing with scientists. You may not know this, but researchers are really judged very harshly on how much they manage to publish or not publish. So if you do a lot of research and come up with exciting results, you are expected to publish those, and not just publish them in any old academic journal, but in really highly respected journals that are read by lots of different people. And there's a lot of pressure to do this because it's something that can really influence whether you get promoted, whether you get research funding, whether you get a job somewhere. And so people are really stressed out all the time about getting everything just perfectly right in a paper and making the paper look really good and be really influential. And there are lots and lots of journals that are out there, but they all are in different tiers. And you look at the tiers of them and kind of see the best journals by looking at what's called an impact factor. And this is something that basically looks at how many times these journals are cited by other researchers when they write about their own new research. So when we write about our particular topic of interest, we have to talk about other findings that have come before us and allowed us to do what we've done. And in the process, we cite these previous papers that have already been published. And journals that have lots of citations look really good because they've obviously collected together all the best researchers and all the best findings, and that makes them very prestigious. And so things that have lots of citations like that have a very high impact factor, whereas things that aren't often cited as much, so things that tend to be very esoteric or they aren't very broadly applicable to things, those aren't cited nearly as often, and so they have quite low impact factors. And lots of people, as you might guess, are all trying to get into the journals that have the highest impact factors. And those are things like Nature and Science, which you might have heard about, Proceedings of the Royal Society, Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences in the U.S. There are all kinds of journals that are really highly respected. And the ones that tend to be the most popular are the ones that don't just specialize in any one field, but actually publish papers from a large number of different fields, and so can kind of pull together all the different disciplines and highlight supposedly the best papers in all of those. And to just give you an example of how incredibly difficult it is to get your paper into any one of these journals, I have pulled together some of the recent statistics from the journal Nature. And Nature receives, or at least it did as of the time I downloaded this information, it might even receive more than this now, but it received at that point 200 papers or so a week, every week of the year throughout the year. And only 8% of these can actually be published in the pages of the journal. So already it's a very, very small proportion of papers that it actually has space for. But it gets so many of these that it just, it's completely inundated, and they don't even have the time to read all of them to judge whether or not they're worthy of being published, let alone actually decide from the ones that they have read which of them should actually find a place in the magazine. And so what they do when they get all these things, they decide which ones should be passed on and kind of judged by other academics in the field, and which ones aren't worthy of that much attention. And once they've rejected those second group, they can focus on that first group and send all these papers out to people who will read them and say, okay, this looks like pretty good science, I agree with this should be published. Or they might say, well, I don't know, there are some issues here that need to be clarified, and then maybe it can be published. And then there are also going to be people that look at it and say, actually, I think this was, terrible science, this should be tossed out. And so that whole process is called peer review. And the people who are reading your paper are, in fact, the people who are kind of experts in that general field. They might not do exactly the same thing that you have done, but they kind of know enough about it to judge whether or not the science was good. And unfortunately, sometimes that means that these are also the people who are your competitors, or they might even be your collaborators, and either way you might have kind of some influence there that is potentially negative. So you don't want someone who's your collaborator always judging you and saying yes, because that means that your paper might get in when maybe it shouldn't, and so that would kind of be dishonest. But you also don't want someone who is your enemy always judging your paper, because then they can put their foot down over and over again and say these results shouldn't be published, this is terrible, even when maybe they are great results and they're kind of groundbreaking and just quite different. And both of these things do sometimes happen, unfortunately, although we try to minimize that as much as possible. We try to have lots of different people involved in the process to mediate it and to judge it and to moderate to make sure that it's all being done quite fairly. So once a paper is selected for publication, it is published hopefully within the next couple of months, but sometimes it can take almost a year for something to find the pages of the journal once it's been accepted. And actually this is much better now than it used to be, because we have online pre-publication, so basically as soon as your paper is accepted and formatted correctly, then it's put up on the internet so people can get your results really quickly and not have to wait until the next magazine actually comes off the presses, and that's really great. And what you find when you look across all these papers is that they tend to have a lot of similarities in the way that they're written. All of them, for example, are always going to emphasize how their ideas are quite novel and exciting and useful and really just generally spectacular. And that's because you have to grab the attention of your reader, and you have to show them why this paper, as opposed to all the other 20 or 30 or 40 papers that they have in their inbox, is actually worth being read and then being cited. So you really do want to stand out, and you want to be persuasive, because you want those results to actually matter. You want people to use them and build upon them and cite them in other journals, and actually to have them influence the direction that science is going. And all of these papers, or at least most of these papers, are written with all of the same sections. And this is true across biology and also even from one discipline to another. So biology, medicine, astronomy, geography, all sorts of papers tend to have the same kind of general format. So I'm talking about a lot of these things that you may not have seen before, but actually you can now see these if you're curious about how this actually kind of looks on paper. Because a lot of these journals do require quite steep subscription prices, but some of them are now available online for free. And these are called open source publications. And you can go online and just click and find the PDF, or click and find it in HTML version, and you can read through all of this primary literature yourself. You no longer have to be wealthy, you no longer have to be an institution, you don't have to be a scientist, anyone can have access to this stuff. And it's really great because, a lot of times the research that we're doing is funded by, money that comes from people out of taxes that they pay or donations that they make. And so why not allow any old person to come along and read the results if they want to? So if you are curious about this, I suggest that you kind of look online and find some of these citations and look at them in person to kind of see what I'm talking about. But basically the first section of almost all of these things is an abstract. And an abstract, you might remember from when you were doing research kind of in your high school days or maybe when you were an undergrad. It basically summarizes everything that is talked about in the paper. So it's a nice little summary to let you know whether or not you actually want to read the rest of the paper in detail and find out all the nitty-gritty details. And I'm ashamed to say that there are lots of times when researchers just don't have the time to read an entire paper. And so we'll go through and just quickly kind of read an abstract, get an idea of what happened, and then put that into our citation database and think about citing it later when we're writing about something. And it's a terrible habit, but it is a really useful thing because at least that way, if you don't have the time to read the whole paper, you do still kind of know what was reported in it so that you can then learn from that and move on and use that information in your own research. So after the abstract, we have an introduction, and the introduction is something that contains a lot of background information to help explain why it is that this particular study was important, to explain what work has been done before and what questions remain, and how this study is going to try to answer those questions. And it might even say a little bit about how these sorts of data can then be applied and used in some way. So why it is that we can use these sorts of data to make further advances in the field. And a good introduction should not just describe what the aim of the study was, but also describe the hypotheses and the predictions associated with the study topic. So researchers should always go into a scientific project with a particular question in mind that they want to answer, and to design their observations or experiments so that they can directly answer that question. And it's always a really good idea to discuss that in your introduction so that as people read through the rest of the paper, they can say, well, do these methods really help you answer that question? Do they actually are they appropriate for this type of question? Do the people really set out to do what they want to do and test this hypothesis? And sometimes the answer is no, so having those guidelines there to begin with can really help you see whether the paper was well written and the study was well performed. Now after the introduction, there's a section called Materials and Methods, or just Methods. And this is basically a really nitty-gritty discussion of every single thing that was done to collect data and to analyze data. And this can be quite tedious to go through if you don't care about all these details. And a lot of people, especially when they're starting off, they don't understand all the techniques that were involved. So they kind of skim this and they just get to the results. But this is a really important section because if you want to go out and do these types of projects again yourself, then you can actually learn a lot from this, and you can use these details to go and do that same thing. And in science, we always strive to create things that can be replicated, so we can make sure that this wasn't just a fluky result, or that we didn't make some sort of little mistake somewhere. Or actually, if you're pioneering a brand new technique, you want someone else to know how to apply that technique in their own study species or in their own kind of habitat or environment of research. And so a lot of these methods sections can be very detailed and tell you about temperatures that were used and what was the humidity level when the data were collected, what was the subspecies of the organism that was being studied, all sorts of really specific information so that you can judge whether something was well done, and you can go out and do it yourself if you want to. And a really important section in the methods, usually located right at the very end, is something about statistics. And there are some fields of science where people don't really use statistics, and this is perfectly legitimate. Some people do completely observational stuff, but a lot of researchers do have huge data sets that they run through computer programs in order to analyze significance values and to see how repeatable something is, and to really test beyond the shadow of a doubt whether something happened by chance or whether it happened because there really is an actual pattern in nature. And this is another section that a lot of researchers can get a bit itchy about because stats can be very scary and confusing and quite complex. But it's really important to look at someone's statistical analyses and say, does this test actually allow them to ask the question that they're asking, and can we then use this result that they've stated here as something that is useful and reliable, or is this maybe not quite the right thing that's been done here? So then the really exciting part of the paper is the section after the methods, and that's the results. And the results section is where the researchers will tell you what have they found. And amazingly, this can be a really short section, so you've put in months and sometimes even years of work, and you've done hours and hours of analyses, and you have huge databases full of numbers, and you can boil it down to a little tiny section that's maybe half a page or a page long sometimes. And it's just mind-boggling how all of that time and effort that you put in can collapse into something so completely small. But it is a fascinating section because this is where you can find out the exciting new discoveries that have been made. And researchers will always try to accompany these discoveries, not just with textual information and numbers, with the results of their stats tests, but also with nice images that will help you understand this information kind of at a glance. And so there tend to be lots of figures and graphs and flow charts and photographs of things. And that's really a good way to present your science to the public, because people can understand things much better if they're looking at it in kind of a visual form as opposed to reading it and trying to interpret it in their own heads. And so that's one of the things I think is really a shame about presenting science to the public through the media, because the media often aren't able to access those images and show them to people, and those can be very, very powerful ways of expressing the information that was collected from and resulting from a study. So after the results section, the paper will end with a discussion, or sometimes a discussion and a conclusion. And this is kind of an interesting section because the authors of the study will, they'll have their results and they have their own interpretation of the results, and they'll have also their own agenda, how they want their results to be used, or how they think that these things can be applied in real life. And not all people will agree on these things. The result that someone else finds about, the impact of turbines on bird populations, for example, that's a really contentious issue right now, so it's actually kind of a good example. That might be completely misinterpreted or interpreted very differently by different groups of people. So for example, if you find that 100 birds are killed per year, some people might say, oh, that's a huge number of birds, that's way too many birds, we shouldn't allow that, we should shut down all the turbines. But other people, seeing those same results, might write in their discussion, well, this is great because 100 is only a very small proportion of the total bird population, so that means that turbines are actually quite safe and we should have lots of them. And it's amazing how very differently different people can interpret the same results, and that really comes through in the discussion. And people will often be aware of these sorts of controversies, and so they will compare and contrast their own results with those of people who have different ideas. They might kind of talk about how their results have moved the field forward and how these compare with things that we found in the past, and now we know so much more. If they're really interested in applications, so for example, if they're conservationists, they might lay out very specific plans about how these things can be applied out in the field. So taking that same example of the wind turbines, people might say, okay, now that we know that 100 birds are killed per year, we should put netting around the turbines to keep the birds from flying into them. We should shut them down at certain times of day or certain times of year to make sure that they aren't affecting the birds. We should put them only in places that aren't pathways associated with migration. So they can give really specific examples of how to use those data, and so those recommendations then can be used by other people. And not everyone will do this sort of thing, but it can be really useful because sometimes you as the primary researcher know a lot more than someone else who might just be reading these results. And so if you make those suggestions, people who are actually able to implement them might take those and then actually put them in action in the field. So that's all the stuff that's contained within the body of a paper. But you can find some other useful things as well if you kind of poke around a little bit and do a bit of research. And I've talked about this in the past with science journalism students and told them that there's more to reporting a science paper than just reading it and kind of trying to figure out what it was that the researchers were investigating and what their results were. And that's because you have to take into account not just what I was talking about earlier about, kind of the quality of the journal, which might say something about the quality of the study itself, but also, who are the researchers and what institution are they from, and how long did it take their paper to get published, because that might give you an indication of how much people disagreed with it or not. And so you actually can kind of find out some of these details by looking in the paper. So for example, if you look on the title page, or sometimes on the final page, you'll find out when the manuscript was received at the journal, and when it was revised, when it was finally accepted, and you can look at how long that took. And sometimes if it's a very short period of time, that suggests that the paper is really exciting, people consider it to be really groundbreaking, and so they want to hurry up and publish it. If you find one that has a really long period of time, you might actually think, well, maybe this study was deemed to be a bit suspicious, people weren't too eager about publishing it, they really dragged their feet, so maybe I should take it with a grain of salt. Now it might also mean that there were some editors that potentially they had a personal beef with one of the authors, you never know, and so that could mean nothing. But it is a clue that you can use when you're reading these things to think, how much should I actually think about this paper as something that's really advancing science? How much should I really believe about what they're saying? You can also look at the authors themselves and see a bit about them. So if you were to read this study about the turbines and the birds, and then you were to find out that the authors were actually medical doctors who specialize in researching something about pharmaceuticals, for example, you might say, well, do these people actually have the expertise to go and do a study on this topic? And it's possible that they do, but it's also possible that maybe that's a really good point and they don't actually. So you should look at the departments that people are in and the institutions that they're affiliated with, because that can give you an idea of whether these people actually know their topic as much as they suggest that they do in the paper. And you can also figure out a little bit about who has been involved in the research project. So in my field at least, what we tend to do is have a particular order of names, of authors' names, to indicate what their role was in the project. So on the papers that I produced while I was a doctoral student, my name is first. First authorship is considered kind of an honor because that suggests that you've done a lot of the work. And then my advisor's name was last, and usually the last person in the list is the person whose laboratory the work was done in, the person who kind of looked over everything, also often the person who provided the funding for it all. And then the people in the middle are people like undergraduates and field technicians, people who have offered statistical advice or kind of other technical expertise. And so if you're someone who's interested in maybe asking questions about this, you want to call someone up and say, hey, I've actually seen this out in the wild and I have a question about it, you can kind of judge by the order of those names which of those people you should get in touch with and ask questions about. Now I won't really bore you with any more else about the anatomy of a scientific paper, but I will say that there have been some kind of interesting recent studies exploring the effects of certain stylistic techniques on readers. And they found that different types of scientific title can impact readers in different ways and will affect how widely cited papers are afterwards and how highly regarded they are. And it's amazing to think that if a title is written as a question as opposed to as a statement, that can dramatically impact how much people think it's a reliable study, it's an exciting result. If it's really long versus really short, if it's funny, maybe makes a reference to a movie or a book, that can also impact people's opinion of things. And I thought that was interesting, not just in scientific papers, but really in anything, because it suggests that all of us will react to these little things when we're reading any kind of headline on the internet, in a newspaper, wherever it might be. So it's kind of funny to think that you can manipulate readers by altering your title, and that you as a reader can be manipulated by what someone else has written. So that it is a bit scary to think that even just going into the paper, you might already have been influenced by what that paper is called. So I'll stop there, and I'll play another song here. We'll go with Down by the Sally Gardens, and then when we come back from the break, I will talk about two brand new studies that have just come out this week. And that was Loreena McKennitt with Down by the Sally Gardens. And the reason I've been playing a couple of garden-themed songs is that the first paper that I want to talk about is all about the importance of gardens for conservation efforts. And this paper was written, the study was performed by people who were studying gardens in Switzerland and in Germany. So they're Europeans not too far from here, which suggests that potentially their results could be very applicable here in the UK as well. And since we love gardens so much in this country, I thought actually this would be a perfect thing to talk about, because it might get some people thinking about what they could do with their own gardens in order to help out with the wildlife. So these two researchers have defined garden as a private space that's adjacent to or surrounding dwellings, so obviously the places that we live. And these can include a variety of things like lawns and ornamental plots and veggie plots, ponds, even things like pathways and patios and temporary buildings. So really kind of anything that's outdoors that's not permanently covered in cement, that has some bit of vegetation somewhere. And private gardens in Switzerland, at least, cover actually quite a sizable amount of space, so over 1% of all of the land in the country, which is pretty impressive. And gardens represent a large proportion of all the green space in the country, and so when you think about it, actually they could make a really significant contribution to conservation efforts in that area. And recently, there's been some growing interest in something called wildlife gardening, and it's also known as ecological gardening or naturalistic gardening. And I don't know if I've talked about this on the show before, but I have read about it in the past, and I have written a little bit about it on the blog as well. And it is something that's becoming increasingly popular because it's all about basically doing less to your land so that it looks a bit more natural, and supposedly will be better as a habitat for wildlife. And when you think about it, that seems like kind of a perfect trade-off, because you don't have to work quite as hard, you don't have to sink as much money into it, it still can look very pretty and be kind of exotic in appearance, but it's also having a really nice impact on the local wildlife, which really seems to kind of tick all of the possible boxes. And what this technique involves is using organic compost where possible, avoiding the use of pesticides, avoiding the use of fertilizers, not doing any or very much weeding, and also cutting down on the amount of mowing that you do. So as you can imagine, this can begin to look a bit unkempt, but the kind of trick is to make it look to make it look unkempt to the point where it's just kind of wild and vibrant, and it's maybe kind of like what you might see if you walk down a path outdoors, as opposed to looking just out of control, like you're in the middle of a jungle and everything's just overgrown and it's going to eat you alive. So it can be kind of a tricky balance, and people can be kind of sensitive about this because they don't think that it looks quite tidy enough. And this is actually one of the things that the researchers wanted to investigate. They were worried that, maybe people are not doing this technique because they don't like the look of the product, or they're worried about what their neighbors might think about how it looks. Maybe they don't know enough about it, so they're not really sure how to incorporate it in their own management scheme. All these sorts of things that might somehow prevent people from engaging in this act. Excuse me. So another thing that often is involved in wildlife gardening also is the inclusion of things like food and nesting space and water and all sorts of structures that can be used by wildlife to make the place more like home. And these can also potentially be perceived as unseemly. For example, a wood pile might not look quite as pretty as a nice bench and a pot into which you'd put some pretty flowers. And so it's really all kind of a question about what kind of things can we do to ensure that people are happy to use this technique but don't feel that things have gotten totally crazy out on their lawn. So results have shown from previous research that ecological gardening can have really huge impacts on local populations. And what's key then is to understanding how people perceive the aesthetics of it so that we can link together these good conservation effects with potentially the good aesthetic effects, and then maybe get kind of a snowball effect where we're doing more and more of this as it becomes more and more popular, more and more socially accepted and kind of pleasing to the eye, and then has cascading positive effects on the local environment. So the researchers here were interested in looking at, kind of the human engagement with these kind of places that are managed by locals. And they wanted to see whether people can appreciate the amount of species, the number of species that are present in these plots. And they also want to see whether the number of species is at all related to this act of doing wildlife gardening. So basically, they want to say, is this technique actually improving biodiversity, and is that something that people perceive when they're looking at it? And if they enjoy the look of these gardens, is that enjoyment stemming from biodiversity? And this would allow them to theoretically put kind of a price tag almost on the gardening technique, which would then maybe allow them to kind of sell this to more and more people. Because if you have greater enjoyment and greater biodiversity, then that suggests that we should be cultivating biodiversity and improving kind of the public experience. And this is something that could be rolled out not just in local gardens, but also in public gardens and national parks all over the place. And it might make people think twice about saying, well, biodiversity is not really that important. Sorry again. So what they did in this study is they looked at 36 private gardens in Zurich, not just the city of Zurich, but the entire canton of Zurich. And they gave questionnaires to the people who own these gardens and manage these gardens, and they asked them kind of about their attitudes about these gardens, their attitudes about biodiversity, how do they perceive the gardening technique, how do they perceive the aesthetics of their own gardens, what kind of techniques exactly are they using. So basically getting an understanding of what these people are doing in their own gardening lives, and also how do they feel about gardens in general. And then they went out and they surveyed all of these gardens, and they looked at all the different wildlife that could be found there within a given period. And so they were hoping to connect then the type of management regime with the number of species that could be located. And they took photographs of the gardens so they could then show these photographs to other people who'd never been there before, and those people would then rate the gardens and say how attractive they thought they were. And all of this was to kind of get an understanding of whether these naturally gardened areas were considered to be attractive, whether that attractiveness increased or decreased with the amount of natural gardening that occurred, and whether that correlated with the number of species that were found in these areas. And of course the researchers had some specific ideas about who would like these things and who might not like these things, and they thought, for example, that older people might prefer more conventional gardens because they're just not used to this new style. They thought that women might be in favor of more ecologically managed gardens because previous studies have shown that they prefer higher richness when they're looking at photographs of gardens. So they did have some specific things that they thought they might get out of this study. So what they found ultimately was that gardens contained anywhere from 0 to 7 of these beneficial features that I mentioned, so these things like ponds and birdhouses and food for the birds to eat. But only about a third of all the gardens have these kinds of features. And right away that tells you that actually, although people are doing ecological gardening, they're not doing maybe the most extreme version thereof. And indeed, when they looked at all the different things you could do to have kind of an ecological gardening technique in your yard, there's an index that ranged from 0 to 11, and the average number that people reported was about 3.5. So this suggests that even though there were lots of people engaged in ecological gardening, they weren't doing it to a really extreme extent. So no one had, kind of a jungle growing out in their yard. They tended to have some, compost use. They tended to maybe not weed all of the time, but they weren't doing anything really crazy like just letting it grow as it would completely out in the wild. Now, surveys also detected quite a lot of species per plot in some of the areas, but this really did range a whole lot. So although 271 different organisms were found across the whole study, only 21 were found in some sites, but as many as 105 were found in others. So there really was a huge difference, even within this one little area of Switzerland, in terms of how much wildlife a particular garden could be home to. And they found certain species that were really common, so things like buttercups and types of clover. Things like honeybees were really common, and the type of snail were really common. So there were some species that would be found pretty much anywhere, but other species that were a bit more specialist and had to have a particular type of habitat in order to thrive. But what's really interesting is when you start looking at the attitudes about gardening and also how people felt about the gardens that they were shown pictures of. So gardeners themselves felt that ecological gardening was less time-consuming than conventional gardening, which is good because that suggests that more people might be inclined to do it. They also felt that gardens were really important habitats for plants and animals, so they recognized that these weren't just managed spaces back in their yards, they were actually places where the animals around them and the plants around them could actually find a place that kind of would act as a refuge. Most people tended to regard their own gardens as being quite natural and also quite beautiful. So, I mean, you might expect that, of course, people would get their gardens to look the way they want them to look. But that is kind of an interesting thing because beauty and naturalness didn't always necessarily go together. But people always did put those things together with their own gardens, even if they wouldn't with other gardens around them. And another interesting finding was that ecological gardening increased with increasing perception of the importance of gardens as wildlife habitats. So the more that people realized that kind of naturalness and lack of chemicals and lack of mowing would be something that was actually useful, the higher they felt this to be on their list of ways to contribute to conservation, the more and more they did it. Which suggests that if you go out and try to educate people and get them aware of the use of this technique, they might actually do more and more of it quite easily because they would see how easy it is to actually contribute to the conservation effort on the whole. Now, when people went out and they took these pictures of the gardens and showed them to volunteers, they found that most gardens were considered average to beautiful on the aesthetic scale that they used, which is kind of nice because it seems to suggest that people respond positively to green spaces in general. So if there was never a garden that was actually rated as ugly, that kind of suggests that any green space is a space that we do kind of like because it appeals to us, often because we do spend a lot of our time in these disturbed environments that aren't quite as pretty and relaxing. But what was quite interesting actually was that it wasn't just the gardening practices that influenced these ratings. So it wasn't, you know, the fact that people could spot that it hadn't been mowed or it hadn't been weeded or there was a compost pile. What seemed to really drive it was the presence or absence of ecologically relevant features. So those ponds and bird houses and bird feeders that I mentioned, all these things when they were present seemed to make people very pleased with the appearance of a garden. It seemed to make them inclined to rate it more highly. So if you want to impress your neighbors with your garden, then you definitely should include a nice little pond or a bird feeder hanging up in a tree. Now when people were asked to describe the gardens they were looking at, they often called them neat and natural, but they never considered them to be things like special or exotic, and they were given this list of adjectives and asked to choose from them. And that's kind of funny because even though this type of gardening technique is not really common, it still didn't stand out to these people as being something kind of weird and special and brand new. It was still something that they could perceive as fitting in with their habitat in some way and kind of belonging in that environment in Switzerland, which again is quite good news because it suggests that that's not going to be a barrier then to maybe having this technique catch on. Now certain characteristics were often selected together when people were asked to describe particular gardens that they were looking at. So for example, the terms species-rich, colorful, and natural often went together, and these were all associated with gardens that did have quite a high aesthetic rating and also had lots of species richness. So the environments that had lots of wildlife living in them were very colorful, they were very natural. Another combination of terms was wild, chaotic, and not neat, which might sound a bit negative. And these are the ones that do correlate, again, very highly with species numbers. So depending on whether you want your neighbors to describe your garden as chaotic and not neat, I don't know, this may deter you a little bit, but there is also kind of a beauty to some chaos, if you like, and this was something that seemed to foster a lot of wildlife species. What's really interesting is that even though previous studies have found that people aren't very good at perceiving biodiversity and judging whether or not an area has lots of species, the people in this study actually were quite good at that, and they were generally able to identify the gardens that had lots of biodiversity in them, and to identify areas that were kind of more ecologically managed as opposed to those that were managed with a more chemical, traditional kind of mowing lots and weeding lots kind of technique. And in fact, when asked directly what they thought of these sorts of naturally managed habitats, people did say, actually, we think these are very important habitats. We wouldn't mind having these right next door to us, even if they do look a bit unkempt, because maybe a part of the aesthetic value was the knowledge that these were places that did have lots of animals and organisms, and that is something that is also considered beautiful in its own way, even if it's not quite the traditional sense of beauty that we often associate with gardens. And in the discussion section of the paper, the authors go on to then kind of say, what does all of this mean? How can we apply this if we really can? And what they seemed to conclude was that there's maybe a not in my backyard kind of mentality that's going on, so that people will look at these gardens and say, oh yes, they do look very nice, and I quite like that. I wouldn't mind it if my neighbors had it, but I don't know that I want to have that in my own backyard, because I prefer something that's a bit more trimmed, it's a bit more traditional. They're nice little pathways and pots, and it's not quite as unkempt. So the question is, can we maybe overcome that? Is it something that has to do with a lack of knowledge? So can we educate people about how to achieve it? Can we kind of get them to change their minds about what's beautiful and what's not? Can we convince them that the amount of time and money that they would save would actually be worth having a bit more kind of sloppiness out in the garden? And that's a really good question. And one thing that the authors do point out is that there's something called garden contagion. And this is an idea that has been presented in previous work that suggests that a lot of gardeners will, on purpose or not, mimic their neighbors. So if you look out and you see that your neighbor has a certain style, a certain plant, kind of an overall certain aesthetic going on, then you will often kind of mimic that yourself. And so maybe if there's one person, or if there are a couple people on a block who are pioneers and they go out and they decide to have this type of management out in their gardens, then they might be able to get other people to engage in this as well, and it would kind of have a snowball effect. So you've got more and more people engaging in this new technique of gardening, and then that would catch on and potentially have really significant impacts on the local wildlife. And this is particularly important if you think about the fact that we now are increasingly living in cities and in suburbs, so more than 50% of the human population now lives in an urban type of area. And all these massive blocks of buildings and cement can be really problematic for wildlife, because even if they can live in green spaces that are outside or even within these massive areas of human disturbance, it can be really hard for them to get there, because they have to cross big distances before they can get to an area of appropriate habitat. But if we can have lots of little gardens in these areas, even just a little plot that's on the rooftop of an apartment complex, or the little section that's just right outside your front door, a couple of little planters that you might have along your walkway, if we have organisms that can use those as stepping stones to get to these larger parks, or to get to the other side of a city, or to get wherever it is that they want to go, then that would be great, because that means we can continually be replenishing their populations. We can help them find mating partners and breed. We can help them find resources like food and water, and which again will keep them alive and keep them going. And so actually just having a few of these would be really fantastic and have huge implications, and having lots and lots of them around the city could have really massive implications, especially if you think about things like global warming, climate change, and worrying about whether we have enough green plants growing, enough trees to sink the carbon, and using your garden space to do a little bit of that could be really fantastic. Using your garden space to encourage birds that might eat the insects that would otherwise bite you and give you allergic reactions, that's something else that's really handy. So all of this would have kind of a carry-on effect, and not just be linked with how pretty does my yard look, and is the aesthetic good enough to impress my neighbor, but how well does the whole ecosystem function, how much biodiversity is there in the area, and how much conservation can we really achieve with just a few little minor changes in the backyard. So that is something that has just been discussed and presented just this week. It's brand new and hot off the presses. And I think it is quite a nice paper to think about, so that you can think about maybe some of the little changes that you can make in your own backyard. And because I got so excited about this, and because I got so excited about explaining how scientific papers work, I'm not going to have a chance to go through the other paper today, but maybe I can do that next week. Actually, it would be great to hear from you guys, because if you kind of like the idea of talking about brand new papers, brand new findings, rather than having a specific topic that I go into in detail each week, that would be great to know, because I can kind of change the format of the show and do this more often. So I think that's it for me today. Of course, as always, I will be updating the Wildside webpage to have information about all the stuff I've talked about, all the songs that I've played in the show. And speaking of that, I'm going to end this afternoon on Secret Garden by Bruce Springsteen. And I believe that's all, so I will talk to you next week.